For the Bennington Historical Society's program. I'm Robert Taggart, Vice President of the Historical Society and Program Director of the Society at the Bennington Museum. These programs are a presentation by the Bennington Museum, and they're free and they're open to the public. For today's program, you want to keep your video off, and you can mute your audio as well, so you don't get any background noise during the presentation. And you can use that full screen option for the best result, probably. And then when the presentation's over, we'll have you turn on your video and your audio if you wish, and you can ask questions, or you can type the questions into the chat area, chat screen there, chat room, and we can deal with them as they come up. So the program is also going to be recorded. So if you want to go back and listen to it again, and I'm sure you would, you can get it on the Bennington Historical Society website, which is part of the Bennington Museum. So today we have Jane Radocchia. She's an architect specializing in old homes, and she's an architectural historian. She's worked on many houses from 1710 to the current day, and she's learned how we build houses. And as our needs change, how those buildings change with new materials and new technology. So the title is, What Can We Build? Architecture as Technology. And let's just wing it over to Jane and go ahead.
Thank you. I want you to know that the way you say my name is Radocchia.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Just
sorry about that. I'll fix it next time.
It's okay. I'm really talking about how we did what we did. So I'm talking about power and what kind of power we had, what kind of tools and machinery we had, where we got our information, and mostly I'm going to deal with wood here and a little bit with brick. I'm not going to, I might mention the names of architectural styles, but that's not really what I'm interested in. And I won't really talk a lot about culture, although it's certainly important. Every image I have in the slide, which is in the presentation, which is not a photograph that I took, I know where it came from, but I have not included all the credits. And if you're curious and you want to know more, you just have to contact me and I'll tell you. So Dina, next slide. And then the next one, please. Okay, this is where we begin. We needed stair. No, let's start over. I'm using newel posts because they are something that we all know and see and can touch, that are markers of where we are culturally and with technology especially. So when we start here, we don't have newel posts. We don't have ladders anymore, but we just have tight stairs that go to the attic, and we need to enclose them because if you don't enclose them, the heat will go up, and you're trying to stay warm with a wood fire. Okay, Dina, go back, please. Here we have now in 1800, 3 different periods. We have the first one, which is Old First Church. We have the second one, which is the Norton-Fenton House. And we have the last one, which is Southshire School. And you can see that one is very plain. The other is the railing is the thing that's important. And the third one, it's been turned. It's a tree that's been turned on a lathe. Next, please. And then next. Okay, so by by 1865, we're doing something completely different because technology explodes. And then by the 1880s, we have so many choices, we're not really sure what we're doing. Next, please. And by the late 1890s, 1900, we've again changed in terms of what we're looking for, what people want. So I will stop with, you'll see those again and you'll know where we are. Next. So here we begin. We're doing awfully simple, straightforward shelter. This is the house in Williamstown. It's on the green. It's a box. It has a door. It has a window. It has a loft. It has a chimney. It has a ladder. And that's what we built when we first came. Next, please. What we could build, here's the tools we had. And here's how we built it. We're taking the trees, we're turning them into posts and beams. And you can see with the tools that are around there, he's got an adze, he's got an axe, he's got a mallet, he's got some twine, he's got a chisel. There's no saw. He's cutting a mortise, and he's cutting the mortise. There's the tenons sticking out there, and the tree, the house is fit together with a post and a beam. And here's on the side is an example of what you'll see. Next slide. No. Next, the other direction. There. So here's what the frame looks like. This is a house. This is an existing house on Murphy Road. It was built by the Breckenridges when they first came, which is 1769. It's post and beam. It's mortise and tenon. That's the frame inside that house. You can see it doesn't have many windows and has only a small front door. But if you look in the illustration on the left-hand side, you'll see the little tiny stair hall going up to the attic, and that it's closed in. It's the entry, but it's in the orthographic projection down here. It's the entry, but it's also closed in and it's tight. You didn't need a newel post there either. Next one, please. So that was an English-derived design. We also have in Bennington the Dutch derived design, and pretty soon we have French, German, everybody else too, because they all come up the Hudson River and they then disperse into Vermont, as well as coming across the other way. But they tend to be not painted. We could do whitewash. You could use turpentine and skim milk and lime to make whitewash, which would color your house. And you could then add things to it to have color. But we didn't have white yet. Next slide. So by the time we get to Rockingham Meeting House, which is 1790, we do have white. But that's because they still didn't put it on the inside. And you can see that the Rockingham Meeting House is a big box with a fancy front door. And then it has a wing on the side, which is the staircase. So the meeting house doesn't have any heat, but the staircase where people are coming and going is closed off. Now there's 3 doors. There's another stair hall on the other end. And on the other end is for men. This staircase on the side is for women. And the front door is for dignitaries and funerals. Even when you got married, you did not come in the front door. So, but what I'm looking at here is that by the time they finished the Rockingham Meeting House, they had paint. Next slide. And they had it in Bennington. This is the painting in the Bennington Museum. Linseed oil and white lead. Linseed oil, of course, comes from flax, and the white lead had to be modified with vinegar, but we painted everything white. Pretty dramatic. Okay, next slide. So after you've seen the Rockingham Meeting House, you think, and 10 years later, we built the Old First Church. It's a completely different understanding of what a church should be outside. It still works the same way inside. And it does have 3 doors. And I've never heard anybody say that it was men, women, and dignitaries. We all go in the main door. But we now, I'm listing for you who built it because we know. We also know who built the Rockingham Meeting House. We often don't know who built these buildings. But our building, our church, comes from a tradition in England that took 70, 100 years to get here, of looking back to the classic forms of Greece and Rome. So the next slide. So here's James Gibbs' book, published in 1838, of a church he built in 1828. And this is the quality of engravings that can be done in London at that point. And this is what came to the States as a book. And that's how people learned. Some people would be going back and forth, but if you wanted to give it to your master builder, he had to look at something. So next slide. The first place that copied James Gibbs and St. Martin's in the Field, which is that church, is the one in Philadelphia. And we know that it looks like the Bennington Old First Church because when we're in the Old First Church and visitors come, sometimes they're from Philadelphia and they tell us, oh, this is like Christ Church. So I haven't seen it yet. I haven't gotten down there to visit. Then the next church, which I don't have a picture of, is that's copies from Philadelphia, is St. Mark's in New York City, which is now surrounded and very hard to get a decent picture of it. We think it's possible that Lavius Fillmore, who built the Old First Church, had seen, because he was on the seacoast of Connecticut, had gone down at least to New York and maybe to Philadelphia and seen these churches. Also, the community in Bennington had seen them. So next slide. So, but James Gibbs and his English book on architecture is not the only influence. At the same time that Lavius Fillmore is building the Old First Church, Owen Biddle in Philadelphia is publishing his pattern book. And what you've just seen with James Gibbs is called a pattern book. It just tells you the pattern of what you should build. And so Owen Biddle publishes the diagram on the left, which is how you build a dome out of wood. And we have that dome at the Old First Church. And it helps immensely with the sound. We've seen the frame, and the frame matches Owen Biddle's. So the question is, did Owen Biddle copy Lavius Fillmore, or did Lavius Fillmore copy Owen Biddle, or were they friends? All that's possible. Next slide. I have to mention Asher Benjamin here because he was publishing earlier. And you can see that compared to what James Gibbs drew, you know, this isn't nearly as sophisticated, but he has this church in his 1797 book. He did not ever build anything like that. I think he copied from a church that Laelius Fillmore built before he got here, partly because in his drawing, he shows a raised roof over the pulpit. And here in the earlier church of Laelius Fillmore down in Connecticut, that very same dome is built. So I think that although Asher Benjamin's really important later on, I don't think he influenced the Old First Church. So the next slide. Okay, the Old First Church has these immense windows. And I want you to think about what it meant to put that many big windows in the church. Glass blowing had to happen by hand. It was the fire had to be, was a wood fire. You can see behind the men, there's a bellows to make it really hot. You're spinning the glass and then you're making it flat and then able to cut the glass panes. And if you go to the Old First Church and you look carefully, especially on the second floor, the glass is very wavy. This is why. So the fact, next slide. The fact that we are using the technology, we're using what we have, but we're showing off. Now, where do we put the glass? Well, of course, we want to emphasize the pulpit, but we also need to let the light in so the minister can read the Bible. He's up there and we want him to preach from the Bible, and all these churches will have big windows behind the minister. Okay, next one. Underneath all of that white paint at the Old First Church is a timber frame. Here are pictures of it. On the right-hand side, you can see it's all numbered. All those beams, they go into a certain mortise in the posts. And this whole thing is wood. So next slide. I think all of you are familiar with this one. Those columns are trees. They go from the foundation below the first floor up into the attic, where they are then mortise and tenon into the beams and the trusses for the roof. And they were trees that were debarked and then smoothed and then made round, and then the moldings were added. All that stuff was added and painted. Next slide. So we had the power, we had the tools, and we had we had paint, but we also began to have power, water power. The first thing that they did when they came to Bennington within the first 2 or 3 years is set up the mill. And the mill was for grinding grist, which is corn and wheat, and for a sawmill. Perrin Creek is a fabulous example because it drops 100 feet in a mile, and therefore the water can go through many water wheels and power many machines. Next slide. So here's a sawmill. This is the kind of sawmill that we would have had, the first one. Oh, are all the no, it's not historically correct, because all the houses in Bennington supposed to be white. Probably at some point in their life, just as they are today, they were painted white. But styles change, as I will show you, and probably there were many houses in Bennington that were not always white. I'm not sure we have any color photos of them during that period, though, or photographs that we could colorize. You know, white is a preoccupation that we got in the 1920s when we wanted everything to be colonial. But I want you to see that there's, right on the right-hand side, there's one saw blade going up and down, up and down. And when it goes down, it cuts, and then it comes up, and then it goes down again. Now, this was much better than a pit saw, but it takes quite a lot of time. Next slide. So when you get that board out of the sawmill, it's pretty rough. And you have to sand it. You have to plane it. The plane in the upper corner is a plane that would be used for smoothing. And I put a sugar packet on the back end of it so you could see how big it is. It's really a hand tool. The blade is about like 3 inches. And it was used to smooth both the cabinet door here and the paneling at the Old First Church. So when you look at the church and you look at a house that has paneling and you say, well, that's just, you know, you got to put something on the bottom because that's where people knock their feet and their chairs. Well, it all had to be done by hand. Next slide. So now we get to another industry, which was manufacturing iron. You can see we've got a water wheel on the left. We have a bellows. We have a huge furnace. We have men bringing iron ore to be smelted. And if you know about Bennington, you know there's Ore Bed Road on the west side of Bennington. That's where there was ore. And then we know that on the east side of Bennington, we had a foundry. But the fire cooks the ore and it comes down and runs out the bottom. So this is a pretty time-consuming and laborious, energy-consuming occupation. Next slide. Okay, so once you get the iron, then you got to make it into something. And here's a blacksmith. Again, he has a fire that's being made hot. It's a wood fire. It might be a charcoal fire, but to make charcoal, you have to cut trees and then cook them deliberately so that they become charcoal and they make a hotter fire. And he's got a bellows, and a huge bellows, which is made from wood and skins, tanning, either cow leather or horse leather. So here's the man actually physically making the tools, and they're shown here. Some of these tools are shown here on the lower left corner. Next slide. So when you are at the Bennington Old First Church and you look around for iron, you're going to see it. You're going to see it as hinges, as latches, and you won't see it, but it's nails that are in the floor. But everything else is put together. Everything they could put together with wood, they did. The nails at this point by 1805, more or less, could be cut individually. There were machines that would cut them like a paper cutter into strips, and then the heads would be put on by hand. So it's terribly labor intensive and precious. Next one. So there's some special things that people would have. The glass globes that were blown at that time to carry, have candles in them. The two that are in the Bennington, in the Old First Church, are copies of what would have been there. And then we had candle holders that were at the intersections of the pews. We did not have a chandelier. Later on, when they needed a chandelier, they would borrow from the Willemsack Inn, the Fay Tavern, the courthouse. Next slide. So here we are back at newel posts. These are the ones from the old first, the right-hand one is from the old first church. The left-hand one is from Owen Biddle's pattern book. And you can see that they're speaking the same language. You put something fancy underneath the stair tread for decor, but your newel post is still very plain. It's a stick. Next slide. Oh, and to tell you that the staircase is in the front entry, what was called a porch of the church, so that again, the church would not have to have the cold of people coming and going. The church has no heat. There's no place in the church to put a fireplace. So one of their solutions was, their technological solutions was to have box pews. So you are in your own box with your own heat, and you bring your own heat from home, which is the foot warmer on the right-hand side. That one belonged to the Deweys. There are 3 more in the museum. You put soapstone in that you'd heated overnight in your fireplace, and then it radiated heat in the box. The interior box is tin, the outside box is wood. You put it in your wagon, your carriage, you put your feet on it. When you come to church, you put it in your box. And at lunch, you go to one of the taverns and exchange your soapstone for another, so you can come to the afternoon service. That was considered okay warmth. When it got time to add cast iron stoves to the church, there were many people who objected and said, we do not need heat. So next slide. I think. But at home, technology is changing. The church doesn't have fireplaces, but at home we have found that the Rumford fireplace has replaced those big cavernous early fireplaces. The Rumford fireplace has sloped sides and a sloped back, and therefore it radiates the heat into the room. It was brought to the United States by Count Rumford, who was an American who had gone and worked and lived in Germany, and the Germans had better technology, and he brought this design home. On the right-hand side is the side view through the chimney, and you can see how shallow it is and how it has a shelf there, which helps the fire with the draft of the fire. Now, everybody knows that heat goes up, that the fire goes up unless there's a wind, but this helps the draft be more deliberate. So next slide. So all of those, the white paint and the glass and the better fireplaces, as well as there's another, also a different kind of way of living that revolves around each room being able to be separate and not all the rooms joining, having doors into each other. So we get to the Pliny Dewey house, and you can see that the chimneys are not in the middle. They've been moved out to the ends. There's a fireplace in each room, but the windows are bigger, the rooms are taller. The front door has a transom, and it has fancy molding all around the outside, that grand entrance. And then at the eaves, we've got corbels, dentals. We have now enough people in Bennington to be able to hire someone to cut all those pieces, import I don't know that we may have been making glass down in Adams. I'm not sure. But we have a sawmill, but we also have a paper mill. And we have other mills on the river, and we are becoming a town, not just a village. We have a courthouse. Next slide. So at about the same time, just after sometime around here, I'm not sure about the date, instead of just having one blade for the saw, we get more blades, which means that we can saw more lumber at the same time. Wow. Well, we begin to have a proliferation of lumber. And here you see on the next house, on the next slide on the right-hand side, back one, please. Back. The other way. Okay, stop. You can see that the wall is made out of these boards. Instead of planing them and using them for special occasions on paneling or in the church or for your cabinet around your fireplace, they're just putting them up for walls. This is the Miller's Toll, which is right beside the Walloomsac, which was probably owned by the Safford Mill people, and the mill was right across the street. So we find that we have a proliferation of paneling. Okay, next slide. And just after that, we have, wait for the round columns. I'll get there. We have Asher Benjamin publishing again. Now you remember that his first book was a little bit amateurish. Well, now he's moved to Boston. He has a better printer, he has a better engraver, and he's doing quite sophisticated work. He starts publishing in one series in 1804 that goes through enough printings, still being printed in 1830. And we're pretty sure that Hiram Waters, who lived on Monument Ave, had a copy. He writes about going into Albany to get it. So he's got the picture. Now, next slide. And so he's going to copy Asher Benjamin on the front of his workshop. And he does the columns and all the detail on the corners properly, but he does not seem to have a way to make a fluted column. Instead, he makes what's called a reeded column, which is all those stripes on the column. And he can do that because his plane can make that pattern. Okay, next slide. Now, I'm pretty sure that he built the Norton-Fenton House. And this is a two-family house. And if you look at it, you can see it has too many front doors. But it basically is two houses like the Plenty Dewey house that are set side by side. And then it has this pediment and the columns put in front. The pediment is the triangle at the top above the columns, the major columns. And the three major columns are still trees. So this is a tour de force, but he's still using the older technology. And he, on the outside, it's still the tutorial center, and on the left-hand side is the Heritage Bank. And you can go in both of them and look at the next slide. Next. Here on the bottom are the drawings that Asher Benjamin has in his book about what your moldings ought to look like. And up above, you will see that they've been copied. The planes were made, the knives were made to make those moldings. And the one on the right-hand side is from Hiram Waters' own house. And he's using another one of Asher Benjamin's illustrations to do his molding. So we're getting the carpenter is getting his idea from the pattern books, which are made for the carpenters. Next, please. And Asher Benjamin's very thorough in technical instructions. Here he's telling you how to make a curved railing on a staircase. And on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side are the instructions for making a volute at the bottom of the staircase. Next, at the newel, next slide. And there's the staircase. There are two of them, one on each side. That railing that comes right out of Asher Benjamin's pattern book, and the volute at the bottom again. And you can go and touch these, and they feel wonderful. And they were done in 1838. Note that the balusters are a little bit interesting. He's kind of invented his own. They are all hand turned. They don't all, if you look really carefully, they don't match, but they're hand turned on a lathe. This is not easy work. Next, please. So just at the same time, down on the Hudson River, the guy, Woodworth, is inventing a planing machine. And there's the patent pictures of his planing machine. And what a planing machine does is it makes, you don't have to use the hand planer anymore. In the lower diagram, you will see a circle on the left-hand side, a circle with a curve. And right up above it, you can see that's the handle. That's how you turn the machine. There are belts and there are pulleys, but you seem to turn the machine by hand. And the machines are, you can't buy the machines, you can rent them. They are leased. So, but they come very quickly to Bennington and North Bennington in the 1840s. We get all kinds of planed boards being used in what's now called Greek Revival style architecture. And this is not a big house, and yet it has very handsome columns that are corner boards, both sides. Next slide. So within the next time Asher Benjamin updates his pattern books, he tells you how to make columns that are hollow. Part of this is because although we had the wood, a lot of other places don't have enough wood. It's being imported from Albany, becomes a clearinghouse for lots of lumber yards, people that are cutting lumber in the woods, bring it down to Albany, and then it goes down the river to New York. And Asher Benjamin's telling you how to use those pieces of wood. There are 8 sections there. Each one is cut into 3 flutes, and then they're held together with clamps and horsehide glue. And he gives you written instructions, which are very interesting, about how to do it and how careful to be. And so here we have one at what's now the town offices. Next slide. There's the town offices. So we have, if you look at the town offices, and it was the Roots house, and I don't know who built it. I would like to say that Hiram Waters built it, but we don't have any record. There's those columns that go around, and then on the first floor, there is the flushboard siding that was made possible by Wentworth's machine. Also up there in the roof, in the gable, the pediment over in the attic, that also has flat board siding. So Bennington is using the latest technology to build for the roots to build their new house. This is classic Greek revival, very beautifully done. Next slide. Meanwhile, of course, the machine gets upgraded and Wentworth sells his patent, and here's the next iteration. It was also manufactured down in what's now Beacon, New York. So it could easily have come here to a lumber yard someplace here. You also still had to rent it. And you can see that it can do many more. It probably works faster. And not only does it plane the lumber, but it also provides the tongue and groove on the side so they fit together very smoothly. So at this point, technology is just racing ahead. Next one, next slide. And here we build the Julius Norton House. The moldings are very similar to ones that Hiram Waters used for himself. But so he may have built this one, but he's got the columns from Asher Benjamin and all of that siding, every place, not just up in the pediment, in the attic, every place is that flush board siding. I also want you to see what's happened with the windows. They go to the floor. You actually can walk out those windows. Not only can we manufacture glass, but we're not so worried about heat anymore. In fact, the chimneys, you can see them up there, but they're really not very important. Oh, we have to have chimneys. Anyway, next slide. Back to newel posts. What's happened with newel posts? Well, I've shown you this one before. This is rural Vermont farmhouse. Was Sidney Colvin's house. He's up to date. He's stylish. His newel is turned on a lathe, but it's not as fashionable as the one in Troy. Troy has much more stylish, much more. It's up. Troy is. They get it first, and then it kind of trickles up. Either up Route 2 or up Route 7. Route 7 has been cut through by then. And also the newel posts are still, they're hand done, whereas the ones on the other side, I'm not sure about. In Troy, I'm not sure about. Next slide. And something that you saw the window that's behind the old First Church pulpit. Well, we begin to have other ways of lighting. Kerosene comes in the 1859. We kind of have it before, but that's when you can buy it. And it would be much better for playing the piano than the candles that are on either side of that piano. This piano is at the Park McCullough House. Next slide. So we also at the same time harness steam. And if you see that this is a toy boiler to show people how steam works. There's a boiler, you heat the water with the fire that's underneath in the red section. You turn the pipe, the steam comes through the pipe and you see there's a little red handle and it goes into a piston which goes back and forth and turns the wheel. This means that you don't have to worry about whether your mill pond is full, or if there's you can have water that you can take and put someplace. So you don't have to have your mill or your power directly on a mill, on a water source. You could take your steam engine to a field where you were cutting wood that you had just brought out of a woods. Next slide. So not only do we have much more dependable and reliable and power, but we also have new machines. A sash saw goes up and down, and it only cuts when it goes down. And when it goes up, if you have a thin piece of wood, it can break it off. But when you have a circular saw that goes around, it just keeps going. It's also faster. Supposedly, these were invented by the Shakers. The Shakers didn't keep track. There's not a really, and they let all their patent, they didn't patent anything. So we're not really sure. So next slide. Then now that we can cut wood faster and smoother, and we have more power, we also get the train. And the train can move everything. Goods, people, machines, coal, kerosene, slate, tin. And I love this picture especially. This is a bird's eye view of Bennington, because if you look at the factory down there, which is the mill, and you look which way the steam, the smokestack is, the smoke is going, it's going one way. Then you look at which way the smoke from the train is going, it's going the other way. They added the train on the drawing. But the train is not, it might be carrying people in the last car, but the rest of it is all bringing stuff to Bennington. And that's what happens. We have the ability to have all kinds of power come to us. Next slide. One of which is coal. We don't have to depend on burning trees anymore. They're mining coal in Pennsylvania, and they're bringing it up to Albany, coming across on the train, and those are the old towers on the railroad in North Bennington, delivering the coal into the coal sheds, where it can then be taken to where it's needed. So we've got power, we've got heat and power in a much more dependable and hot. Next slide. Aha, and we use it. These are cast iron stoves that are made in Bennington. They're in the museum. We could have heat, which is much more efficient. It's just, and then those fireplaces, it can last, you can stoke it up and have it last all night. And it's even, but as I put a note on there, they really did think that to have your house more than 50 degrees in the winter might not be safe. You would not be healthy. Okay, next slide. I've got to hurry up. Park McCullough. I'm going to show you Park McCullough because it has both. It has both slides. It has both sides. Next slide. It was built before everything else. Built during the war, before a lot of the innovations that came through the Civil War were able to be used by many people. Still is also using old technology. That staircase goes back to what you saw at the Norton-Fenton House, and the tower is something that has been used as part of a fireplace. The heat goes up and then it goes out the tower, so it's cooling. It's cooling. It's called the Venturi. So next slide. The porch, which is also cools you in the summer. This is a summer house, but that ceiling has matched boards which we put on the face of the Julius Norton house, is now being just commonly used for the ceiling. And the planing machine, you see, evolved and it morphed into this amazing thing that gets painted. as well as being useful. Next slide. What have we missed? We missed something. Maybe not. We heat at the Park McCullough House with coal. Those mantles had to be imported from France. They couldn't be cut in the States yet. We didn't have the tools yet to cut them. But the grates, each room had coal heating. But also Trenor Park had a central heating system. It didn't work very well, but he put vents through the whole walls of the house, and there is one of his grills. Next slide. Here, the moldings you see that they're cutting they can make huge moldings. These you couldn't do with a planer. It'd be quite hard. And I put my hand there to show you how big and fat they are, and they're all over the Park McCullough House. They were just in love with the newest technology. They also have very big windows, and not only do they not need them, they have the big window, but then they put etching on it. Windows for letting light in, while here he's keeping the light out. He doesn't want people, that's the entry, and you're not to see in until you've been welcomed. Next slide. And those windows are all across the house. You can see how many they are. Now, I want you to see in the inside, they didn't know how to do a window that went up and down, a sash that slid up and down, with a curve at the top. So the window on the inside is rectangular, but on the outside it's curved. Next slide. They put in shutters. Which you can make because of the circular saw. Now you see there's 3 different ways. Circular saws are just proliferating. They can be little ones that you could have in your workshop, or they could be in factories. And you can make all of those shutters, which you couldn't make before because the slats would get broken. And the shutters not just keep out the light and the cold, but our paints are not very stable, and they protect the color of the paints. Next slide. Aha, yes. I couldn't get a good picture in the Park McCullough House of the newel posts, but here we are, 1869, and Trenor's putting this in, and his architect put it in 1864. So part of my question is, did the architect influence the pattern books, or what? That we didn't get the one on the right. The one on the right would have been overwhelming, and the one we have is overwhelming enough. Please go and look at it and touch it, touch the railing anyway. Next slide. We still are using daylighting. Those bay windows were used for places to read, to write. This is Lizzie's in her bedroom. We've got the windows, the shutters closed so that we won't fade the house. But she would have opened them and been able to write almost any day of the year. But she needed that daylight. The kerosene, the gas lights are really not good enough yet. Next slide. However, Trenor Park did have gas lights put in his house. It had a lot of controversy about that. The tank that held the gas was out in the yard, where if it exploded, it would take down the house. But I wanted you to see behind the flowers reflected in the mirror is me. That's how far away I am. And the lighting is being reflected in the mirrors to double, triple the amount of light that it gives. This is a very good technique. And they were trying, but gas lights they're better than kerosene, but they're not really they're not very successful. Next slide. By the 1880s, the technology is crazy, and we have schizophrenic. We can do either the one on the right or the one on the left, and sometimes people mix them. I want you to see the balusters on the left are turned in a spiral. That's very hard to do by hand. And now they've got a machine that does it. Next slide. The heating, when the house was built, this is Lizzie's remodeling before the president comes. When the house originally had carpet, Laura, who's the mother, who was Trenner's wife, she was very proud of her carpets. But by 20 years later, the heating systems have been remodeled and upgraded enough that Lizzie can take them out and put in these amazing parquet floors. There are 6 rooms on the first floor of the Park McCullough house, and each one has its own pattern. They're worth visiting just to see the floors. Next slide. Upstairs, Lizzie opens up the house and puts in that huge bay window, glass window in the back. You can see it in the upper right hand from the outside. There it is on the inside. That had been a room there, and she's added the light to give the second floor hall, which is a very wide hall, light. It's a tour de force. It's just the modern thing to do at the time. Next slide. The fireplaces now are reminiscent of the old home place. The one on the first floor, which has that's Highland Hall wearing a mask in the middle, is decorative. So is the one upstairs in the parlor that I just showed you by that big big glass window. They're pretty. They're fun. They give you a little heat if you sat beside them. Next slide. And here's my hand around the moldings that go around the downstairs fireplace. You can see that they're the latest thing in 1880. They are much finer. And you see some of them, the spindles have that barley corn, that twisted spindle. This is the latest technology, and they're showing it off like crazy. Next slide. The bathrooms get upgraded. And this comes from maybe from the Mott catalog. The Mott catalog is shown on the left. The bathroom is shown on the right, and the bowl isn't quite the same. And we don't have a receipt from buying it, so we don't know. But we're no longer the plumber and the electrician and the carpenter, no electricians yet. The plumber and the carpenter are not in charge anymore. The architect and the owner are in charge, and this is a vast difference in how we are doing our style and technology. The technology of printing has changed the way we build. Next slide. So this is a quick, I think I'll skip brick because it's 3 o'clock. You want to skip brick? Go ahead. Just go through them. Okay, fret, just quickly we'll show you this. We have a machine that will cut these. And they're all over Bennington. Go ahead, next slide. You can see them, they're wonderful. They were not white. Next slide. Here's one that was probably done by hand, because you could also get a saw that tapered to 1/4 of an inch at the far end, at the sharp end. And here's wonderful individual, somebody's own invention. Next slide. And the newels instead of being this friendly newel on the left-hand side, they look pointy, and I don't want to bump into those newels. They're sharp. Next slide. Our framing has changed. And I can't get into that now because there's technically, it's too complicated. Next slide. I can show you, but I can't do it quickly. But paint is coming. This is an advertisement for a paint catalog. And this is just one of the choices. They did not want you were not to paint your house white. You were to decorate it. And here's color choices. Next slide. Here's some more. This was put out by the Scientific American magazine. This is what you're supposed, if you took off the color here and the decor, you could see that this is many Bennington houses, plain, but that's what they were supposed to look like. Next slide. Even farmhouses had to be, the paint colors change early on, beginning about 1860, 70, as we begin to mix them with all kinds of chemicals. And white was exciting, but then we could do these other gray, stone colored, that was also exciting. But even ordinary farmhouses not only have different paint colors, but they have different surfaces. There's wood cut, there's shingles in there, there's fancy porch moldings, there's big window on the first floor. Next slide. And then we get to real central heat. This is an ad in Bennington, 1896, for a good heating system. Just puts it in the directory. Next system, next picture. And the paint, that means that the chimneys don't have to be on the inside anymore because the chimneys acted as radiators. Well, now we have cast iron radiators, and we don't have to have our chimneys radiating into the house. This is a drawing which may have been based on the Campbell House, which is across from the St. Francis de Sales Church. Next slide. So we do everything. All those things that we can have. Would you like one? How about 2 or 3? How about 4 balconies? How about a bay window? How about, it goes on and on. Next slide. And we do it again. I counted, there are 11 different windows tines on the front of this house and 6 different textures. Next house. And the newel posts on the left-hand side are what you can buy mail order. And the one that we have at the Campbell House, which is much simpler, is still decorative, but it's not nearly as overwrought as the one on the left. Now I think, next slide. This is what's coming. We get tired of all that. This house has lots of different windows. It's got lots of places, but it's all done with one color shingle and trim. Next slide. Now, this is where things change. We get electricity, we get the telephone, we get the combustion engine. So this is where I'm going to stop. Next slide. And also, there's an awful lot of machinery in there that I would really like to find and be able to show you. And I don't know where, I haven't done the research yet. The end.
Well, good job. Good job.
Thank you.
We got a few questions here in the chat room. Let me just get them up here. James Moore asks, the planing machine was painted and decorated. I know the British had that custom. Did American manufacturers do that also?
They must have, because that comes out of a friend of mine, he's in Illinois, who collects these machines and has them in he uses them. And he sent this to me when I was asking him about the planing machine.
Oh, cool.
But also there's a website, vintage machines, I think, that has a lot of information about these machines. So you can look there too.
Yeah, and I know I seen a clock work one time, which was racing stripe, pinstriped and decorated quite nicely. So I guess it was done quite often.
Yeah, this one, because it was inside, you see, didn't fade.
Okay. Also, Michelle asks, how soon did house colors change from white to multicolor?
Well, in the early period after the Victorian, after the Civil War, if you look at the Park McCullough house, for example, it was those yellows. They've taken it back to that yellow and green and brown. And those were the first kinds of things that we did. And then we got really outrageous. But it's just like everything else. You start mixing paint and then you think, well, I could try this. What about that?
Very good. Very good. We've got a couple of thank yous from other people. A wonderful talk. So that was grand. Everyone for coming.
Yeah.